The time is at hand.
The elusive dog-like creature attacks livestock, bleeding them dry of blood.
8 to 10 feet tall, shadowy aliens.
But I am telling you right now,
we need a great reset.
And this is extremely dangerous to our democracy.
Babylon the Great is fallen, is fallen.
Welcome to In Dark Places. I'm your Huckleberry, Junebug Fugit. And I certainly hope you survived all the carnage of the 2024 eclipse. I'm on vacation this week, and as usual, I'm just kind of working around the house, cutting some grass, organizing my Doomsday Prepper building. I've been having a lot of adventures with Brandon, and at some point we're going to do some hiking. Call me crazy, but the first thing I think of when I think hiking is Bigfoot. This week on the show, we have some Bigfoot encounters. These are all real stories written by real people of real encounters. And it's going to start off kind of short and sweet. And I don't mean that their story is less important, because I look at it as little pieces of a puzzle to help us understand these creatures. Here we go. This story is written by One Day Trader. When I thru hiked in 2018, I never seen him, but I'm sure that's what it was at night that I occasionally heard. It was like a big stick beating on a hollow log. Just gave you the shivers. And this story was by Blue Indian. My girlfriend and I were hiking No Bow around Silver Bald in North Carolina. I stopped on a trail to prep for a safety meeting. It was quiet, no wind, no birds, nothing. All of a sudden, about 30 yards downhill, a group of trees shook violently. I'm not talking about some wind blowing the trees or even something falling out of the tree. Multiple trees growing in a small group all shook hard for like 10 seconds before everything went dead silent again. This is a known Sasquatch tactic. Les Stroud had the same thing happen to him in British Columbia, and he got it on film. I've also heard many tree knocks. One time I even had something reply back with tree knocks in Georgia. I was all alone, midweek on a trail. The knocks kept coming from all around me, so unless random people, humans, happened to be knocking on trees in the middle of the week. Annual Reflection says, I saw one back in 2011, mid-October, right before Skyrim came out. My college roommate at the time was driving us downtown, so I wasn't the only one to witness it. The whole encounter lasted about 10 seconds. It ran across the road right in front of us, and even in the dark, we got a pretty good look at it. This was in the PNW, but Appalachia seems like a close second, along with Florida, for their habitual range. Mystery Bigfoot-like creature terrifies visitors to England's South Downs by T.K. Randall. Thanks, T.K. Something strange is roaming in South Downs, that is, at least according to reports of a mysterious creature that has allegedly been seen and heard on several occasions around one of the region's lakes. Some of these reports come courtesy of fishermen who claim to have encountered a growling creature on a particularly rough piece of terrain with a sharp incline.
I felt incredibly on edge, and it was a feeling I can honestly say I had never experienced before or since,
said Mike Brown.
It really was as if something was watching me, and I was not welcome. I think the most standout thing is the terrain, being covered in the dark. It sounds dangerous enough to attempt in the daylight, let alone in the dark. when you can't see any obvious signs of torchlight, there's the really scary part, because no human could do it without suffering injury.
Another witness, Michael Brindle, saw the creature running near the lake. I was dozing in my chair next to the rods when I was woken by a loud growl from the opposite bank, he said. The creature, whatever it was, seemed to run at considerable speed on two legs. He was so unnerved by the incident that he quickly packed up his things and left. The hairs on my arm stood up, he recalled. But could there really be a Bigfoot-like creature walking the shores of the lake? It's worth recalling the recent case of a Bigfoot sighted in Washington state that turned out to be a cross-country runner. It's also possible that the fisherman could have mistaken a conventional animal for something more unusual in the darkness. Whatever the case, I hope I never see it again, said Michael. As much as I doubt what we actually saw, I will tell you the story as it was. 20 plus years ago, I was riding in a caravan of vehicles on I-5. We were heading toward the Dallas for a softball tournament. I don't know exactly where we were. We could have left I-5 and been on a highway, but all of a sudden, we stopped along with several other vehicles on the shoulder. Off into the woods to our right was what appeared to be a Bigfoot. It was moving fairly quickly through the trees and heading diagonally away from the highway. One of the dads who was traveling with us got out his rifle, looked through the scope, and said he was not willing to shoot it because he could not confirm what he was looking at. He just said that it was big and upright, which we all witnessed. We stopped at a rest area not too much further up the road, and my teammates and I drew Bigfoot with sidewalk chalk that we had with us and took pictures to remember the incident. It was a pretty memorable experience for me, but till this day I am not certain what we were looking at. I am well into my 30s now, and it's all a blur of a memory. The thing about this experience is that we were not the only ones who saw it. There were several vehicles who stopped with us, who are not a part of our caravan. They were all just as confused as we were at what we were looking at. So I know for sure it was not a typical wildlife encounter, nor was it an encounter with something that everyone could easily agree on. There was probably a total of 20 people who got out of their vehicles and looked at this thing running through the woods. Not my own personal story. My uncle swears that he saw one. Was down by the Clackamas while hunting and assumed he was seeing a bear at the river's edge until it started drinking water by dipping its hand in the river and drinking from it. It looked over, saw my uncle, then it got up and walked into the tree line on its back legs. He was too stunned to move. Man's been a hunter most of his life. No reason to doubt his word, or any reason to think he was blowing smoke. When my previous boss was a kid, her family had an RV that they would go camping in, usually just finding random wooded spots to park. One night, someone or something came and started shaking their caravan and making grunting noises. They were all freaked out and trying to be as quiet as they could. Finally it stopped, but then this horrible stench hit their noses, and it was a few hours before it completely dissipated. I think it was her dad, and a few siblings. The Lockridge Monster is the name given to a Sasquatch found in Jefferson County, Iowa, in the fall of 1975, after Mr. and Mrs. Herb Pfeiffer reported sighting a large-haired creature on their farm north of Lockridge in early October. They have received numerous inquiries about the creature. 2 other residents also reported seeing the creature. One said that it had an ape-like face, and the other gave this description. It stands up on 2 feet and walks like a man, covered with hair, and has an ape-like face. It has been known to kill chickens, rabbits, raccoons, pigs, turkeys, and sometimes cows. It mutilates the bodies, often not eating all of the kill. The monster's tracks were found near 4 mutilated turkeys, half eaten. Gloria Olson of Lockridge spotted the creature while cruising past an old abandoned farmyard after dark. She knew immediately that it was not a bear. Describing the creature, Olson said that it had a monkey's face and a body covered in hair, typical of a Sasquatch. It is generally described as more like a bear with an ape face than a Bigfoot. Also, it has a foot size of about 10 inches, and it is smaller than the size of a typical Sasquatch footprint. And the Lockridge monster is seemingly more carnivorous than the regular Bigfoot. It is typically around 5 feet tall. A long time ago, well, a very long time ago now, my friend Jason and I were prone to getting involved in many types of misadventures, and this one, while seemingly pointless at the start, proved to be one to remember. While I am uncertain over the name of the campsite in question, I do know that it was one my father and I had visited on many occasions. The site had plenty of parking for camping vehicles, a close-by restroom for people to relax and drop a few pounds in, a nearby kiddie pond stocked with some smaller fish that couldn't escape and were just waiting for their respective number to come up, and a nearby river with a boat rental place for people to troll the river or just fish leisurely. Surrounding all this was open woodland, offering a tree-lined canopy over the camp parking and mountains around us. It was a lovely place to be, and a welcome place for 2 young teens to adventure and explore. One particular night, after a lousy day of fishing that had me slipping off the mud bank and into the kiddie pond, frightening all the fish and causing other campers to curse in anger, pull up their reels, and head back to their camping areas in defeat, Jason and I decided that hiding in the brush overlooking the rivers as darkness set in around us would offer a great opportunity to see the nightlife come alive. And it kinda did. We heard, rather than saw, bats overhead as they picked off insects over the open water. We saw raccoons heading up toward the sleeping camp area with the likely idea of going through trash. There were even some deer that strolled through the dark, weary of anything out of the ordinary. Since I'd fallen into the kiddie pond, I guess I smelled okay to pass as non-threatening. As all this was happening, the familiar sounds of buzzing insects and chirping crickets berated our ears, reminding us of just where we were, and that there was life all around us. But even reminders have a tendency to go mute, like a snooze alarm, not properly set. The silence was not an abrupt one, but rather a dying down, swooping steadily over us, from one side to the other. The clicks and the chirps from the bats stopped. The buzzing of the flying insects around us retreated. The chirping of the crickets in sections went silent. Having been accustomed to outdoor living antics, my friend and I both understood that at that point we were less alone than what we had previously been. Where was this threat coming from, though? And what could it be? We both had our minds set on it being something like a coyote or possibly a mountain lion. Whatever it was, we knew that staying still was in our best interest. Long minutes passed in shared silence, broken only by shallow breaths of expectancy as we strained our eyes in the darkness, trying to pick out anything moving through the leafed canopy and ground brush. A group of crickets off to our left started to chirp again, less lively than before, and we thought that perhaps any sign of possible danger had passed. Suddenly, there was a tinge of an odd scent in the air, earthy, musky, and not at all like the kitty pond scent that now defined me. Where was it coming from, though? Long moments passed in the darkness. To the left, the band of crickets sounded like they were trying to play their version of the national anthem. I was about to stand up and head back to camp, while we could still find it, when an odd shape seemed to detach itself from the trees before us, close to the riverbank. My heart stopped in my throat. The form was huge, almost monstrous in size, but strangely human in its movement. It cast a heavy gaze to the right and to the left before turning and beckoning to another unseen form, still hiding from our shared line of sight. What was going on here? In no time, another form, smaller than the other, came out of the brush and scurried to join the larger one at the edge of the stream. Jason and I were curious, though equally frightened, over what we were seeing. Was this a mother and child drinking from the river? Huge hands attached to long arms scooped water from the river and brought it up to the face, and rubbed it over the hair on the arms and body. They're bathing, I thought. Whatever we had stumbled upon was bathing, both parent and child. Jason and I watched in interest as the ritual before us went on. The entire time, the only thought I was dwelling on was how quiet these beings were. They were like the raccoons we had observed before these two came along. Their movements over the terrain absolutely silent. Eventually the two left their place along the river and melted back into the black of the trees around us. Long minutes of uncertainty passed before the insect noises started up again, in chorus, and we knew that we were safe to head back through the bramble to camp again. As quietly as we could, we did just that. The meeting, though brief, had left the two of us with little question as to the validity that there may very well be something else out there, uncertain, unidentified, but absolutely alive and well. This happened when I was 15, back in 1993. We had just moved to an area called Wakiva Springs, and our house was built brand new and was on the edge of a state park, Wakiva Springs State Park. It was still wild enough at that time that we could only take the trash out 30 minutes before the truck came due to the black bears that still ventured into the neighborhood. Deer population off the charts, and to this day you will see dozens throughout the day randomly in the neighborhood. Wild turkey, wild pig, bobcats, you name it. Our home sat perfectly on the one lake in the area, and the lot was just woods. At that time, we did not have any neighbors or houses to our left or right, although the front of the neighborhood had been built over 20 years prior. At that time I heard of Bigfoot, but by no means was it a daily thought, or even in my interests. When I would get home from school, I would walk back into the woods, maybe 1,000 yards, and explore, and one day I noticed a spot to plant a pot plant. I had just gotten into smoking a joint here and there, and had the bright idea of trying to grow my own plant. I became very familiar with the square miles around my home and grew quite comfortable venturing out there, sometimes returning at dusk. One day, while going to check my failed project of growing a marijuana plant, I saw my younger brother, who was about 11, exiting the patio door about 50 yards behind me. I wasn't entering the woods yet, but I saw he was trying to sneak and follow me back there. I decided to play along and acted like I didn't know he was following me. As I was walking, I would hear him occasionally behind me and would stop suddenly just to make sure. As I got deeper into the woods, I noticed that it was much calmer than normal. Keep in mind, I had been going back there about 5 times a week for a couple months at this point. There was not much else to do. I didn't see any deer nor squirrels, and in hindsight, there weren't even any wind or birds. I remember this well because I could hear my brother surprisingly well, almost too much so. I thought it would be funny if I turned the prank around on him and hid behind a tree and jumped out and scared him as he passed by. It had been about 5 minutes of walking back, and we were deep enough in to really scare him. I found my tree and I stopped all movement and waited. I figured he was only about 45 seconds or so behind me. As I waited, I realized now that there was no sound, as if I had earplugs in, but this meant nothing to me at the time, other than observation. I heard my brother getting close and didn't realize how loud he was. He must be only 20 feet back around the turn. Any second now I will see him, except I never did. The footsteps stopped suddenly, and now I was in the weird position of just sitting there behind a tree. 2 minutes passed, and now I was getting curious. What happened to him? Or did he just realize what I was doing and he was going to scare me? I finally decided to take a look. I went around the corner and could see back a good ways and saw nothing, which was impossible because I had heard him following me the whole time and didn't hear anything after I got behind the tree, which meant he literally disappeared. The woods were now suddenly creepy, and I got a very anxious feeling, the first time ever that day. My head said to head home now, but for some reason I couldn't seem to get my bearings. I literally was lost. I calmed down and figured out a way back on the trail, even though I never left it. It was like my equilibrium was off. At this point, my younger brother was nowhere to be seen, and I was genuinely concerned, considering he was just feet behind me a few minutes prior. I was yelling his name and started jogging back toward the direction of my home. After a couple minutes, I finally heard his voice. He was hiding under some pimento leaves that he had laid across his body off the side of the trail, just laying on the ground. I didn't know what to think, but I said, "Get up right now," and still have the weird feeling that I've had for the last 5 minutes. He got up and I asked him what was happening, what was going on, and he just said, "Please just run. Run to the house with me." I didn't ask any questions and ran back with him. Once we got to the backyard, he said that he had been following me when all of a sudden he smelled something horrible and looked to his left and he saw a big black hairy person thing. Me just being a little paranoid because I was illegally growing a pot plant, said, "What? Was it a cop? What do you mean?" He repeated that it was a big person with hair all over him, and it scared him so badly that he just fell to the ground and started rolling into the palmetto bushes and just sat there frozen until I found him. At that moment we heard a loud bang 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 and a weird scream from the woods behind us. We both looked, and sure enough, hanging from a tree about 50 yards behind us and swinging from a large branch was the thing that he was talking about. If I didn't know any better, it looked like a human being mimicking a large monkey swinging from a branch. It just made no sense and was completely out of place. Clear as day, this thing was a large burly thing that looked more like a person than anything else. We both sat there not knowing what to do. The thing swung off the branch into the woods and was out of sight, but hollering the whole time. We immediately ran all the way to the house, yelling for Mom and Dad to tell them what we saw. At first we got the whole, "Oh, it was just a bear." It was a bear, but eventually later that night, I think they realized that we were serious, and the next day, my dad was able to find a report that in Florida, there were encounters of something called a skunk ape. Over the next 5 years, I would continue to have run-ins with this thing, and 2 times we had a deer leg and skull put in our backyard. Once I had turkey feathers put up on my windowsill. I didn't know anything about what that meant, and only later, as I researched the subject, did I learn about that. He's talking about gifting. Every 6 months or so, the park rangers would have to come out to our home and put a barrel in our yard with a donut to capture the black bears that were too comfortable coming to the neighborhood. After seeing the same ranger for the third time, I felt comfortable enough to ask him what he did with the bears once he got them. He just said that they move him to deeper parts of the park or altogether relocate them, and in extreme cases, and then he said that's something that you don't need to worry about. I asked him what he meant by that, and he just said that there were things bigger and badder than bears out in the woods, and to always be careful. I remember that to this day, and kind of understood what he meant after having had that experience, and knowing that there was indeed something else out in the woods behind my home. Today my parents still live in that same home, and I go visit them from time to time. My dad, being retired, has nothing but time, and it's actually grown to be a believer himself, and over the years has a few experiences of his own, including orbs. The house is about 15 minutes from downtown Orlando, but in an area that is surprisingly untouched by humans. As I said, it's protected state park, and the home is right on the edge of where the park begins. I think when the home was built, we disturbed probably where this thing was staying, or its general area. And then as more homes were built, it got pushed further back, but at the same time still coming in fairly close. It's not a crazy, insane encounter, or dangerous, or thrilling, but nonetheless it was real. I saw with my own eyes, and then had follow-up experiences. So now I'm just trying to learn all about these things. Not me, but a buddy of mine. He goes to your Harry, North Carolina quite regularly and camps with our friends. One night they were all sitting around the fire in the middle of the camp, doing what campers do, and a rock came in at an angle. It was bigger than a golf ball and smaller than a baseball. At first he thought nothing of it, other than one came in and his dog was starting to look off into the woods. So he picked it up and threw it back into the woods. About 5 minutes went by and another rock came flying in. This time it was much closer to him and about the same in size. His dog and another dog that was there started to bark off in the direction that it came from. Again he picked it up and threw it back, and then nothing happened until they went to bed. At about 2 or 3 in the morning, the dogs started going crazy inside the tent, and they heard loud noises coming from outside. A lot of beating and banging around. Something was going through their camp. He and his friend hopped up, grabbed their guns, but were too freaked out by what was going on at that time and from earlier. When they got up in the morning, after not much sleep that night, the campsite was a mess. Can't say for sure what was there. The activity after they went to bed could have very well been a bear, but the rock throwing is what has me curious. The next trip out, I plan on going with them and see what I can find. I personally am an optimistic skeptic, and my friend did not think they were real until this happened. Didn't see it, but smelled a Bigfoot. Riding motorcycles 20 miles into Lake Shasta logging roads, I was left behind by my faster friends. I was doing 15 or so, and boom, I was hit by a smell that hit me on a primordial level. Imagine 1,000 cab drivers plus 1,000 wet dogs took a dump and left it to rot. It's like I knew that an apex predator was near, and my fight or flight response kicked in like it never has. How do I know it wasn't a bear? You just know. I can't and won't try to explain it. If you ever encounter one, you will know exactly what I mean. The smells involved just get to you and you realize you are an animal. This was similar in that you feel it in your gut and accept your fate. It's addictive. I want that feeling again, which explains the TV shows to me. You're just looking for that first feeling again. In September 2011, my boyfriend went to take the dogs out back. My one dog started barking like crazy right away. My boyfriend had a flashlight and quickly scanned the grass line where the woods start, where we normally see deer. Our house is bordered by woods. Something made him shine a bit higher, and he sees two eyes staring back at him, about 9 feet off the ground. As my boyfriend tries to hurry the dogs back inside, he sees the thing turn and casually walk back into the woods, like a man, with arms and shoulders. I have never seen my boyfriend so freaked out. He came inside and closed every window and all the blinds, and refuses to let the dogs out in the backyard at night anymore. In hindsight, there have been a few instances in the past few weeks that we can't explain, like dogs' toys being down by the woods with bites taken out. But it was the placement of the toys and whatnot that makes us wonder. Also, a grunt/snort noise we heard recently. My boyfriend can't get over the size of this thing, and the fact that the eyes were so high off the ground. I asked him if he thought he saw Bigfoot, and he said, after a minute or so of silence, "If I wasn't a believer before, I sure am one now." We moved away the next summer, but just moved back into the house. I have a trail cam posted in the yard, but have yet to get anything on it. We live in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, near the Michigan-Wisconsin border. I've always been interested in the idea of a North American ape. I'm not convinced that they exist, and I haven't ever seen one, but I have no doubts that something fitting the description could survive quite handily across the country. I have had one experience that's left me confused, so here it goes. I've always been an avid outdoorsman. Always hunted, always fished. I'm from Missouri, and I know what we have and what we don't have. We have a few mountain lions scattered around, and even fewer black bears. The only common things that are big and wild are deer, coyotes, and turkeys. And that being said, I really enjoy deer hunting. Our farm is situated on bluffs and ridges along the Missouri River in the center of the state. And while it's actually pretty populated, the terrain is incredibly rough and hard to get around on. That being said, our acreage isn't huge, but the surface area is. All kinds of ravines, gullies, hollows, etc. It was a few years ago when I was halfway through undergrad and went home on a weekend during bow season. So it's a half-hour drive from the house to the farm, and I show up well before daylight. And as luck would have it, I forgot my keys to my dad's box stand. We keep it locked so the neighbors don't vandalize it. That didn't bother me much because, like I said, rough terrain. It isn't hard to find a spot that sits over a game trail where I can have some elevation and cover. And I grew up around this farm, so I knew where trails were. All I had was a pack and some stuff like a knife and rope and tags, my bow, and a little LED flashlight. I took off down the side of the ridge and found a good spot where I could lean against a tree that overlooked a trail with some brush in front of me for cover. I figured I'd wait for the sun to come up and a doe would come by and I'd be home with a deer by lunchtime. Got to the spot, set down my pack, nocked an arrow, and of course turned off my light. I got there probably too early, and there was no sign of daylight yet, especially considering how thick the woods were. I had been standing there for a half hour, maybe 45 minutes, and then I heard a pack of coyotes. Like I said, not unusual. We have those. What I didn't like was that on the ground, with only a bow in the dark, and the yips and howls were getting closer. It would be a real pain to accidentally surprise a pack of coyotes like that. I'd never heard of them bothering people, but you know how surprised animals freak out. So I was just getting ready to maybe arrow a coyote and was listening intently to where they were. As they came closer, I noticed something bigger was with them. My initial thought was that they were chasing a deer. I could hear leaves like crazy and some limbs snapping and stuff like that. Once again, that all makes sense. I had decided it was a big deer, maybe two of them together. They were really tearing up the leaves as they came, and the yipping and howling was right there with them. They must have passed by me 30 or 40 yards farther down the hillside. Went right on by without noticing me at all. They were in a heck of a hurry too. Before I could even think of estimating the time, I had lost the sound of the coyotes in the ravines and woods. So, I kind of eased up then. Probably wasn't going to have to shoot anything for a while yet, if anything came around at all. And right when I was relaxed, I heard this whoop coming from right behind me. I don't know if I've ever jumped up, spun around, or drawn a bow so fast. Of course, you can't handle a bow and light at the same time, so I was stuck there in the dark with something whooping right behind me, with only a bow. You can imagine I was a little tense. After about a minute, I let off the draw, but I kept my release on the string. I didn't move for another hour, not till I could see a ways without a light. After the sun came up enough, I walked out very slowly and kept looking behind me, got to the truck, and went home. I was totally done hunting for the weekend. A friend and I were hiking not far from downtown Salt Lake City in July 2014. After a while, we decided to rest a bit. It was about 5:15 p.m. Since the trail was narrow and crowded with bush, we left the trail to rest under some very tall fir trees, where the brushes were less thick, but it was still shady. July in Salt Lake is close to 100 degrees. As I was leaning on a stump, I noticed we were standing among several trees that formed a teepee shape. As we were noticing and discussing it, I heard a loud crash and then a twig snap a few yards in front of me. My back was to the trail, so I was facing a hillside and deeper forest growth, while my friend was facing the trail with his back toward the hillside. The trees in the teepee formation were to my right about 10 feet, and where my friend was facing them, and the trail. So my head was turned about 90 degrees when I heard the commotion coming from the base of the hillside. I immediately looked toward the sound and saw a hominid covered with dark brown hair, moving quickly behind the thick bushes. He wasn't more than 6 feet tall, and I didn't get a good look at his face because he turned and moved so quickly. I noticed that his hair was two-toned, with the darker hair on his head and shoulders and the lighter hair on his midriff. His legs appeared darker. I shouted, "Did you see that?" to my friend while trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The last time I saw someone tromping through the bushes in that area was in the early spring. There were 2 ex-country skiers coming back down the mountain. The one in front was wearing a blue jacket with the typical two-tone shoulder pattern. So for some reason it was the first explanation that my brain could come up with for what I was seeing there in July. I mean, I could clearly recall the hairy creature, but at the same time my brain was refusing to believe it and was trying to come up with a scenario for the situation. All I could muster was a skier hiking through the forest, not on the trail but fully dressed in dark ski clothes from head to toe in July. At any rate, I then began to call out, "Hello, hey, hello," while also trying to listen for the direction of his retreat between my calls. My friend ran up to the spot to see if he could see anything. He had only seen a blur by the time he had turned all the way around to see what had made the sound, so he wasn't sure what we were looking for. Even though it was only a few short yards to the spot where I saw our skier, there was nothing there. I regained my senses and ran to see if there were any tracks. I found one, but it resembled more of the kind of print you'd find in deep sand, more of a dugout type of depression in the needles. I measured it from side to side, and it was about an inch plus longer and wider on each side than the size 11 Caco sandals that I was wearing. I hadn't heard any crashes through the bushes after the initial noise that grabbed my attention, so I was unable to determine what had happened to the skier after it had passed behind the bushes. There were small green plants covering the ground in the direction he went, but they were only compressed and then quickly ran out at the edge of a very small and gentle ravine running back up the hill. We scanned for tracks, but I didn't feel like pursuing into the deeper brush or up the ravine, so we went back to the trail. Oddly, neither of us felt threatened in the least, and although the valley we were hiking up was very narrow, we just continued up the trail in the same direction our furry friend had gone. We thought we heard movement up on the hillside a few times and from various directions, but still never felt threatened. After an hour or so of high awareness hiking, we turned back so we wouldn't get caught up there after sundown. After giving it some thought, I found it highly suspicious that the creature had absconded so quickly through the brush without any noise except for the initial crash. I wonder now if the noise was a deliberate attempt to get our attention, not as a trap, but rather as an alert, a sort of, "Hey, we're here, please respect our space." I'm never going to hike there alone again, that's for sure, but I'm definitely going back up there with a friend or two. I'd like to look for more indications of an individual or a family group. If a group has moved in, I'd like to know. Otherwise, I might assume it was an irritant male just passing through. The story is by Sasquatch in Colorado. A year had passed since I fully realized they were real, and I'd gotten a couple of friends on board, at least enough to go camping and see what we could find. We ended up at a campground in Lost Creek Wilderness, a little ways northwest of Pikes Peak, Colorado. We really didn't expect to find anything on this first trip, and we were skeptical of the signs we came across until the morning, but we did not notice a couple of things. In an aspen grove nearby, we found an aspen tree that was broken off at its base. Nearby was this area of matted grass. We also found a few broken off trunks, 8 to 10 feet tall aspen trees, sort of hidden, laying behind some rocks. Later that night, sitting around a fire, one of my friends suddenly said, "Whoa, I just saw a flash of light over there." And we decided it must have been a headlight shining through the trees from the road in the distance, but I turned around to look in the direction he'd been looking, and then I saw it too. A bright yellow-white circle of light appeared to peek out from behind a tree some 20 feet away, briefly coming into view before going back behind the tree. We again chalked it up to being a headlight, but examining the line of sight during the daytime, I don't think that's possible. The road is quite a ways away in that direction and obscured by many pine trees. If visible, a headlight would have been scattered by the pines at least. What I saw was sharply defined and circular. Also, definitely felt watched, but I wasn't into trusting those feelings much at the time, so I brushed it off. The following morning, we did a little hike, and as we were getting back to camp, walking along the creek, someone noticed a stick structure on the other side of the creek. It's not possible to get over to that tree without wading through some cold, deep, fast-moving water. We were kind of dumbfounded by this, because not only how, but why would a person make that? And we're making the connection to the broken off trees stashed on our side of the creek. not yet placed. And again, why would a person break the tree rather than using an axe? We stand there in silence for a while, just thinking, and as I'm staring off at this spot in the middle of the creek, a rock splashes directly in the center of my field of view. I asked my friend if he saw it, and he said he had. We both thought it was weird. Later, though, he confessed he hadn't actually seen the rock that I saw, but had seen one earlier that I didn't notice, and just didn't say anything. Our attitude after that first trip was sort of hesitantly amazed. We really hadn't expected anything, and weren't really certain yet, but couldn't deny that we had a lot of reason to go back to that exact spot, which we did 2 days later. This time we did a night hike around midnight. We got a nearby ridge that overlooks a steep bowl-shaped slope a little ways away. I stopped a bit below the crest to catch my breath, so I was the last one going to the top. I reached the top, and almost immediately we heard a powerful crack like lightning from the middle of the other slope, followed by the sound of a tree hitting the ground. A tree broke on a perfectly clear, windless night, right as the last member of our group came into earshot of it. I want to leave my subjective interpretation out as much as possible, but this was an incredible moment in my life. The apprehension from the hike through dark trees instantly vanished, replaced by awe. It was like they were telling us, "Don't worry. We're all the way over here, but don't come any closer." I remember my good friend saying, "I thought it would be scary, but it's just cool." And we were all a little slack-jawed and teary-eyed. We tried to knock to them, but the tree break was the only thing we heard that night. The next morning, 2 of us went on a sunrise hike, thinking we'd stop at the same ridge, but we ended up going all the way up the peak right above the campground. On our way down, we found another stick structure. I think I caught a glimpse of one of them peeking out at us from behind a tree while we were hanging out near that structure, but it was far enough away and obscured by pine needles that I couldn't be sure. There were 2 eyes glowing a pale blue in the early morning darkness, framed by dark brown, with a ring of light brown hair around the face. I could barely make it out, but the thing that kept me staring at it was the peeking motion. 1 eye back behind the tree, 2 eyes back behind the tree. This was accompanied by a strange sounding chirping noise from that location, and another location off to its right. I eventually began to feel very uncomfortable, like we were outstaying our welcome, and insisted we head back down. Subsequent trips back to the spot yielded more structures in the surrounding area, but nothing too eventful. Here's another story from Sasquatch in Colorado. My folks live on the edge of the suburbs, just behind the first ridge of the mountains. There's a road just to the south that runs up a canyon and into the mountains. And if you take that just a little ways up, to your first left, there's a trail that's not well marked or hiked. It's the backside of a system of trails that are well marked and hiked, and it connects with that system at the top, but is hidden. If you went down it from the main system, you'd end up far from your vehicle. It's densely forested, doesn't get much sun, and is almost always snowy, muddy, or both. The first time I brought one of my friends from the Lost Creek expeditions on this trail, we heard knocks, 2 sharp cracks when we stepped out of the car, and another 2 when we started hiking up the trail. I don't remember if we heard anything else at that time, but it was enough to get me hiking this trail pretty regularly by myself, since I was living at my parents' house at the time. Wood knocks and little strange vocals, are things I've heard there too many times to list at this point. Even just a few days ago, I took a skeptic friend up there at dusk, and we heard a couple series of knocks that made him ask, "So were those what you'd call wood knocks?" My ma and I hiked it over Thanksgiving and heard a ton of knocks from all over the place while we were on the top third of the trail. Most I've ever heard, but knocks aren't that exciting and aren't that convincing for skeptics. So let me just get to the more interesting things that have happened there. The closest encounter I've had on my way down the trail after I'd been hearing little noises on the way up, making me suspect they were around. I suddenly heard a loud woo from down to my right. I was feeling good, so I went woo back. In immediate response to this, was it Ric Flair? In immediate response to this, from off to the right, came a loud squawking, screeching sound. I grinned and sat down to see what would happen. Pretty quickly, I began to hear what I thought was, at first, someone walking a dog up the trail toward me. A quiet panting. But as it got louder and louder and louder, I could only imagine the chest cavity of whatever was making this sound to be utterly massive. Rapid, loud, heavy breathing, and it was close, but I couldn't tell where. It definitely scared me, but I had my voice of reason present enough to think, well, okay, I'm pretty sure I know what this is and what it's trying to tell me. I should just take the hint. I stood up and started walking down the trail, and the huffing stopped immediately. I never saw what was making the sound. I tried to entertain the possibility that it was a bear or a lion for a while, but it just doesn't seem possible anymore. It was bigger than a mountain lion, bigger than a black bear. Not to mention, neither of these animals seemed like a prime candidate to try to scare me away by breathing heavily while remaining completely hidden. I suspect the initial vocals I heard were bold, curious youngsters, and Dad got nervous and wanted me out of there. It's not the only time I felt like I was being warned to back off there. Near the top of the trail, near a big tree that's been broken and bent to the ground, and is still alive though, I found a stick structure that's a staple in the Sasquatch repertoire, a teepee. I went back and got my camera and snapped 3 pictures of it, but I felt really uncomfortable while doing so. It's hard to explain the vibey things that go along with this hobby, but I felt like I was violating them somehow, doing something that they'd strongly disapprove of. I had no indication that they were watching me. It's just a feeling I had. Less than 24 hours later, I hiked the trail again, and just inside the trees at the bottom right, in the middle of the trail, was a deer skeleton, fresh, skull with 3 vertebrae attached, and broken femurs scattered about. I can pretty much guarantee nobody had hiked up there since me yesterday, and I had a big feeling that this skeleton was left there for me specifically. I decided then and there never to bring a camera with me again, which is a bit of a shame considering the next thing I found, but I want respect for them and their wishes to be my #1 priority. There's an arched aspen tree that served as a base for a structure that I found a week or 2 later of the teepee structure. That arch starts just to the left of the teepee. That was the base and the mouth for a lean-to type structure at a time in July when we were getting absurd amounts of rain for Colorado. There were sticks placed perpendicular to it all along the arch, weighing it down so the opening was probably 3 to 4 feet high in the middle. All across these sticks, perpendicular again, were 6-inch by 12-inch strips of aspen bark, making a very impressive roof. Maybe one more thing worth telling on this trail, which was another possible brief sighting, but again distant and obscured, so I can't be completely sure. I was coming up to the steep spot where I'd heard the breathing and a crazy amount of loud knocking issued from the cliff to my left, almost like a belated, "Oop, sorry, human, my bad." I just stood there, looking up the slope, and something caught my eye. It looked like a tree trunk broken off, about 10 feet up, but I didn't remember seeing such a tree there. I just kept staring at it intently, sort of jokingly wondering if it would suddenly move. When it did, it moved smoothly to its right behind a tree and out of view, almost like it finally got unnerved by my staring at it. As with my previous sighting, not a clear enough look to say for sure it wasn't a trick of light, but plenty of non-sighting evidence to support that they at least frequent the areas. We are woefully out of time. Sorry about that. It is with great woe that we end this week's show. Thanks for listening. Hope you enjoyed it. And we'll see you again right here next week. God bless you.